Good day, everyone. My name is David Williams, Executive Director of the International Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled COVID-19, an Obstacle or Opportunity for Energy Transition in Developing Countries. We are very grateful to our moderator, Dr. Rula Inglese-Lotz, and our distinguished panelists for today's timely discussion. First, a little bit about the International Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest association specializing in the field of energy economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas and experience and issues among professionals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations, along with a host of other products and services you can find at our website at www.iaee.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our moderator. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have any questions for our panelists, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window and type your question. We have left sufficient time at the end of the webinar to address your questions. And now I would like to introduce you to our moderator, Dr. Rula Inglese-Lotz, professor at the University of Pretoria. Rula, over to you.
Thank you, David. Welcome to all from my side, and thank you for joining us today to this webinar hosted by the International Association for Energy Economics and organized by the South African affiliate. As read in the Economies from the 23rd of the month, following this pandemic is like watching the climate crisis with your finger jammed on the fast forward button. And further down in the same article, the 2 crises do not just resemble each other, they interact with each other. In the recent Global Energy Review 2020 by the International Energy Agency, the expectation for the emissions this year is to be lower by 8% compared to last year. The oil demand lower by 9%, the coal demand lower by 8%, highly due to the drop in the electricity demand by 5%, while renewables are expected to increase because of low operating costs and preferential access. Does this mean that the International Energy Agency suggests COVID-19 is an opportunity for the world's transition to cleaner energy? Governments can and will play an important role in the energy sector's recovery from the crisis. The design of the stimulus packages have the opportunity to link economic recovery with energy transition to sustainability. Some governments have put their efforts into greening their bailouts, while others offer economic stimulus to their heavy industry that might lead to higher emissions. Our speakers today will unpack some of the realities and challenges that particularly developing countries and South Africa face that, if thought strategically, can be turned into great opportunities for the future. A disclaimer here before we start that none of the speakers today speak on behalf of their organizations, but on their personal capacity. And without further ado, the first speaker for today, Mr. Ntumba Kadabwa from the Agence Française de Développement. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question of whether the COVID is an opportunity or any transition with respect to which country the beneficiaries. So like that, not is yes and no. In actual no, it's not great for the transition itself. It's very, very, very long process of complicated. So biofuels and second, demand for the energy to remain on the increase. And what I said before, we we also see that we also see that
Ntumba?
there's going to be a demand
I don't know
for.
if you can hear me. Huh? I think we have a problem with the sound, so for now I'm gonna move quickly to Mr. Dion Hubert from ESCOM, and then I'm gonna turn back to Mr. Ntumba. Let's fix the sound problem, and then we will come back to Mr. Ntumba Kadabwa, just to fix the sound first. I apologize for the problems with the sound. Mr. Hubert, can we hear from you? You should unmute, please, Mr. Dion.
Hey, Ryan. Thank you for the opportunity. Good afternoon to everybody. Well, at least it's afternoon in South Africa. I'm not sure where the other participants are. Yes, I'm going to speak from the perspective of the utility that is in this situation, typical electric utility, and a little bit about the policy side as well. So as we all know, the energy industry is a highly capital intensive industry with very expensive assets, long lead times before establishing those assets in operational mode, environmental impact assessments, other permitting and process issues, and then follows the construction cycle. So it requires views long into the future and assumptions about this uncertain future. And then those assets will last for 20 to 40 years, typically. So the assumptions include, as one of the key assumptions or group of assumptions, obviously what the consumer demand will be doing. So the volume of electricity demand, the shape of that demand, the peak capacity, the night minimum, the daily and seasonal profiles of demand, as well as the location of the demand. All of those things have to be taken into account, and decisions made to be as robust as possible for this couple of decades over which this asset will hopefully be operating. So contrary to the often popular opinion that investment in energy and utilities, investment, especially regulated utilities, is a low risk environment. It's actually inherently a high risk environment. And those inherent risks, however, cannot be wished away. There's no way to know the future. So the more appropriate approach is to adopt a flexible investment approach that can adapt as changes unfold and assumptions are verified or proven to be inaccurate or invalid. There's usually a cost premium for such flexibility, and even so, it will not totally de-risk all investment decisions. So this future must be constantly evaluated and investment plans adapted accordingly to limit these costly consequences, such as investments being too early, too late, the wrong size, the wrong type, the wrong technology, the wrong location. So what COVID-19 has done is firstly to invalidate whatever assumptions or plans existed pre-COVID. At this point, we don't know the impact on overall demand for energy or electricity, nor do we know the impact on the shape or the profile of the demand or the location, the optimum timing, none of those things. At the same time, energy emissions or energy-related climate emissions have probably reduced. So possibly now meeting what previous emission reduction targets anticipated to be met only a few years from now. So we might already be in advance by a couple of years of those targets. However, extra caution is clearly called for with all this unknown issues. But the second thing that COVID has done is as part of the delay in economic growth, it has probably bought a bit of extra time for utilities and for policymakers, in the sense that many of these energy-related investment decisions could be deferred a bit at low risk right now. The deferment could be at low risk. And that is where the opportunity arises. We all know the classic conundrum when it comes to buying a mobile phone or a laptop or any electronic item. The longer you wait, the better product you'll get for a lower price. Unfortunately, at some point, you have to commit to purchase or you'll actually never get the item. So that, in a way that applies. So also in the utility space, you can't delay forever for new technological breakthroughs, but nevertheless, there could be perhaps a bit of a delay now in whatever plans existed before COVID. And that delay provides opportunities for example, to perhaps leapfrog some current technologies, to go straight to some new technologies. Plus, of course, gives the opportunity to respond to changes in demand level, demand profile, the location of demand might have moved around in your country, the demand or the centers of demand. So the opportunity is to utilize the slight respite provided by COVID and slower economic growth to reconsider all these aspects of energy investment. Not only the future level and profile of demand, as I mentioned, but also other aspects such as reliability services, which will become more relevant with higher penetration of renewable generation technologies, as well as the timing of such investments. They might also, there's such a rapid technological advances happening now that 2 or 3 years can make all the difference, but enabling technologies to be considered that if you had to proceed right now, you wouldn't be able to consider it. For instance, there might be further developments in battery storage in 2 or 3 years. And a 2 or 3 year delay could make all the difference in committing now to what in 2 or 3 years time will be previous generation. There could be breakthroughs in small modular nuclear reactors. Perhaps electric vehicles fill up to some degree the night minimum demand, and at the same time offering, when they're charging, they fill up the demand in the middle of the night. But when they discharge or when they're not utilized during the evening peak, they might offer an option for peak supply. Perhaps in the future, distributed generation has an impact on network expansion plans. So this is not just something that can affect the generation side of the industry. Distributed generation can have a large impact on network expansion. That should all be now thoroughly relooked. So there's much talk about the utility financial death spiral, in terms of which lower demand requires higher prices to enable recovery of fixed and sunk cost and unavoidable cost. But the problem is that by doing so, by implementing higher prices, it will not translate into higher revenue due to triggering further demand reduction. Now, one of the keys in dealing with this phenomenon is to try and make as much of your fixed cost and sunk that would otherwise be fixed and sunk cost, to make that flexible, or to delay it, because if you have a reduction in demand but you manage to match that with a similar reduction in fixed and sunk cost, then the remaining costs divided by the remaining demand will result in the same price that you had before. There's only a requirement for a price increase if you've committed fixed capacity, which land up being stranded and underutilized. So the opportunity is to avoid creating additional sunk cost that has to be recovered. So if the anticipated demand is as long as it is matched by that avoided cost, it doesn't trigger this need for the higher prices. So to wrap up, the new risks, there are a lot of new risks and uncertainties introduced by COVID-19, but they're also accompanied by some opportunities. And utilities and policymakers should not miss these opportunities. It can be extremely costly if we get saddled only with the risks and we fail to capitalize on these opportunities that are also presented. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the interesting perspective. I think we can proceed and try and see if we can hear the perspective by Mr. Tabwa, that we have him back. Let's see if the sound is better this time round.
Okay. Thank you. Apologies for
the sound is better this time round. Thank you.
For the interruption. Yes, when you're talking about energy transition within emerging economies or developing economies. There are ultimately three aspects that define this energy transition, and that is access, efficiency, and renewable energy penetration, which is somewhat different and unique compared to the developed world, for example, where their access is no longer an issue. So we have to just bear that in context when you're talking about energy transition. It's not merely decarbonization, but also the element of access, and the energy justice is also a big underlying factor there. So then the question is, in terms of COVID, is it an accelerator, or does it put a brake on the energy transition within emerging economies, particularly with a focus on sub-Saharan Africa? In my view, it's a question of yes and no. No, to the extent where the momentum was already there in terms of the transition. The transition is a very, very long transition. It's going to take a long time, possibly a few decades, especially if you consider the fact that within sub-Saharan Africa, the primary energy fuel is still for domestic use is still biomass, to the extent I think of close to 50% or so within residences. So to make the shift towards cleaner energy is going to take quite a bit of time to achieve. And then with respect to when we say it is a break, yes, it is it's going to put a brake on the development of on the pathway to the transition by way of Africa relies a lot on foreign denominated debt or foreign debt from bilaterals and multilaterals in order to advance the energy objectives. And if those countries, for example, have had to reallocate the budget or to prioritize their own geographies, that could possibly put a small brake on the development of, or on the energy transition within sub-Saharan Africa. But we do not anticipate that that's going to remain for long. The opportunities that could exist then as a result of this COVID-19 is, as you'll see on the screen, apologies, we'll be on three levels. The first being policy, funding, and then institution. If you look at it on a timeline from short-term opportunities and then long-term opportunities, the short-term opportunities then within a policy point of view is the immediate requirement now is to safeguard the established and any new energy policy transition frameworks that were already existing. So the authorities may perhaps look at issuing temporary waivers to ease the burden on the industry or to ease the burden on the companies. But for example, in South Africa, Eskom, with its environmental, it's got some environmental requirements that are a lot more stringent, or that is progressively more stringent, so it has to react to that. But given that they've had a lot of loss in revenue as a result of COVID, there's possibly an argument to say, okay, can we have a temporary waiver, not a permanent structural change, but a temporary waiver just in order to allow the pain to pass through, in order to ensure that they still remain sustainable. Within a policy, what can be done on the long term to extract opportunities from the COVID is then to use the policies to manage the impact of the economic downturn, which is inevitable, particularly putting on the job lens. That may call for, as we deploy more, as we progress to deploy more energy resources, focusing on local development, focusing on local manufacturing to enable job creation and local enterprise development, using it as a benefit, as well as fostering innovation, especially within the retail, or the sales sector. By way of example, again, if you consider the cell phone data network in South Africa, you're able to buy data and your price varies. This dynamic pricing, according to if it's off peak time, weekends, all of that is designed in order to modify behavior to achieve a certain consumption pattern, and that could also be then done for the energy sector as well. The second opportunity relates to the domain of funding. The priority now would be to prevent economic hardship and bankruptcy. So the existing loans or credit facilities that the utilities have access to will be exactly to prevent economic hardship and prevent bankruptcy. The relief packages that has been announced, the big stimulus packages, there's obviously a lot of pressure to green them. Within the African context, it may not immediately be relevant because we're still far away from that from a technology point of view, from an influence point of view, as well as I've mentioned, we're relying on a lot of foreign investments. So the relief packages then could be focused, when they do exist, to creating future policy space to shape the business activity towards a climate compatible pathway. That's on the short term. On the long term, then it could be to seize opportunities for low interest rates for the deployment of capital intensive renewable energy and energy efficiency solutions. A lot of the countries, or at least in South Africa, the monetary policy reaction has been to reduce interest rates by about 250 basis points. It's an unprecedented move in the space of about 2 months. So it reduces the cost of capital, and as we're aware, the levelized cost of electricity, within the levelized cost of electricity, the cost of capital is a big element within that. So it's an opportunity then to leverage that and to develop. We also can anticipate that because the utilities are going to be weakened as a result of lower offtake, the income statements may be a lot weaker than before, but yet they, to a large extent, remain the primary off-taker. So for private sector to participate and continue deploying renewable energy with a weak off-taker, it requires then for the development finance institutions, multilateral development banks to then deploy the plethora of de-risking tools or issue certain guarantees, and moving away from purely traditional loans that they had done in the past. So we may need to see some innovation with respect to the financing sector, international finance. With respect to the third element within institutions, this is something which I think our governments will have to focus on, both on the short term and long term. The transition is inevitable, it is happening, and we have to find a way to capitalize on that. We have to own it. And one way to do that is to look at knowledge creation, especially during this crisis, to do a bit of research, a bit of footwork to see, okay, how has our consumption patterns been modified, energy consumption patterns been modified in light of this pandemic, and then prepare for future shocks if it does come as well, so that we're able to prepare for that and model that. And then in terms of human capacity development, we still reliant on importing a lot of skills for energy, be it technical skills as well as modeling skills. We could find a way to domesticate that and develop that internally, as well as institutional strengthening, where our institutions are able to use this moment to prepare and strengthen themselves for future deployment of renewable capacity, whether it be project management officers, whether it be the regulators, because the transition is happening, and this is a time then it's not time to shy away from it, but to confront it and to make the best of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think just for the audience to not think that we are ignoring the questions that they're sending, I'm just going to give a chance to the other two speakers to make their presentations and share with us their perspectives, and then we're going to proceed with the questions from the audience. We already start collecting some of these questions. So we're going to continue with Dr. Lardu Stander from the city of Tshwane.
Hi, thank you, Professor Ingles. Firstly, I'd like to just add on to what my colleague, Mr. Katabua, said about the economics of the transition. And I always think crises like these afford us a bit of time where we're not under pressure, where we can actually sit and think about what do we really want to achieve with the transition. Now, if you look at the issues of access, efficiency, and renewable energy, I worded it slightly differently, because the access remains access. We need to get people connected to some sort of energy source. We need to make sure that this energy source is somewhat better than the current energy source or the old energy source we have. And then we also need to address the issues of affordability and who actually carries the risk. This is something that Mr. Hubert alerted to from a traditional large-scale utility investment perspective. So I think within an emerging economy, I don't believe in a one-size-fits-all solution for any country. I think we need to say, are you an emerging economy with or without a big national utility already with installed capacity? Because the approach to these two different characteristics are different. I think there is space for a decentralized energy provision in a country where you don't have a really large, really well-developed grid, whether the grid is old or whether the grid is new. But once you have an installed grid, in my opinion, the business case for who's carrying the risk of porting over from a grid-based system to a decentralized system becomes problematic. I think in countries such as Tumba measured, where 50% of biomass still being the main source of your energy provision, we need to be very clear what impact that has on carbon emissions. We saw, as Prof. Inglesi-Lot alerted to at the beginning of this webinar, that carbon emissions only decreased with 8%. And this was during, I think, the biggest economic turndown or lockdown or depression that we've witnessed in the last century. So if we only see a decrease of 8% of carbon emissions, then clearly we should ask ourselves, do we really understand what is contributing towards carbon emissions that we are seeing? And I dare to say that some of these sources of energy that we are typically discarding because we're thinking from a modern perspective of technologies. But when a lot of people use wood and biomass as the main source of energy, this contributes towards carbon emissions. I think we also need to look at prices. And one of the affordability issues for facilitating the economic transition is energy should be affordable. Now we immediately have to say, but what does our information set tell us? Because we have a generation price in South Africa specifically, which is currently one of the lowest in the world, but we have a consumer price that is fairly expensive. And once we understand who gets what from the price, and in South Africa, from a city perspective, most of the cities and most of the policies and legislative functions in cities are set up in a way where cities make a fairly big margin from energy sales to actually fund and cross-subsidize a lot of the other basic service deliveries that they do need to perform in terms of its constitutional mandate. So whilst you have a national utility provider with a fairly low price of generation, you have a consumer that pays a fairly high price for the energy it gets, which is not that green and which is not that environmentally friendly. And what we're seeing in South Africa, obviously, is the same as across the world. We see this rapidly increasing rate of urbanization that puts more pressure on our cities' ability to actually provide these basic services, like water, because of the water energy nexus, like energy, like food, like roads. All those require energy as a major impact and input into those systems. So our prices need to be, and the information set around our prices need to be really well discussed. And maybe this crisis where we have a bit of breathing space in terms of our electricity system is not constrained right now. It's we haven't had. Last year in 2019 was the worst year on record for load shedding in South Africa, where our electricity supply was really constrained. Fortunately, this year we haven't had those similar problems, and obviously with the lockdown and with COVID, we have seen a surplus energy available. So I think whilst we have the time, we need to really sit and think and come up with ways of understanding what this energy transition actually means. Secondly, I think we have a price structure problem within the South African energy sector specifically. And it's also one thing that I think there's a lot of communication that we need to do to consumers and to stakeholders in general. But understanding that, is there a mismatch between the fixed component of the charge and the volumetric component of the charge, whether we actually are creating a policy space for decentralized, typical renewable energy sources to be provided that's not necessarily grid tied. And then lastly, I think during a crisis such as this, it's important to discuss the suite of policies that we have available, not only at city level, but also at national level. Now, in an ideal world, your national and provincial and local city level policies will be aligned and they will be complementary. I think most of you would agree this is not always in reality the case. So if we look at what cities require and its dependence on the selling of electricity as a revenue source, it somewhat tells you how the policy space is muddled by having to rely on that as as a revenue source. The moment that at a national scale you come into a different discussion on what that policy space would look like, you might be in a position where you see a larger adoption and a larger political movement to actually essentially open up the entire renewable energy space within our cities and within our country. I think what the crisis has done, except that it's put some distance between us, but it's also brought us closer here. It is affording us the opportunity to take a bit of time and think through, what does the transition mean? Can a decentralized energy provision in a city work? And most certainly it can work, especially for new capacity. Currently, we're not in need of new capacity, but when we start ramping up, our economy starts opening up, and hopefully we get back to pre-lockdown and even pre-financial repression growth rates, we'll need a lot more energy. Hopefully this energy can be greener and more environmentally friendly, and stable, and provide access to those who have been left behind in the traditional energy mechanisms. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stander. Let's move next to Ms. Lungile Mashele, our last speaker for today before we open up for discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Betts. So certainly this is an interesting time for independent power producers. They've never been here before. For the most part in South Africa, we had our growth trajectory planned out. We knew exactly, we had our 20-year plan, 30-year plans, and we knew that in year 1 we were going to do this, in year 2, and with the entrance of COVID, everything has been turned upside down. You've got energy demand, which has been changed, as the previous speakers have actually mentioned. You've got greater availability. Utilities are having excess. You have a situation in Zambia, Zimbabwe, where their water has recovered, so their dams are filling up. You've got in South Africa also, Eskom has on most days said that they have anything between 9,000 to 12,000 megawatts excess. You are seeing greater trades, which is the Southern African power pool, because then everybody's saying, but why am I entering into bilateral contracts now? I would much rather go into day-ahead trades and look at trading electricity in the short term, because I'm uncertain of what's going to happen tomorrow and what I'm going to need. So even in terms of contracting, we're going to be seeing fundamental changes. You've got lower tariffs that are being introduced also, and perhaps not cost-reflective tariffs, because in this situation everybody is competing, and people will have to come in perhaps less than what their costs actually are. You've got Eskom, which is curtailing plant as well, and their own plant, and they've asked some of the IPPs, such as your wind farms, to curtail their production also with an add-on at the end of their contract life. So for IPPs now, I can understand there's some uncertainty, and people are unsure whether they should go ahead and they should invest. However, in the midst of this, opportunity does come. And I think Africa and most developing countries are in the fortunate situation that there is a need for energy. And so the crisis doesn't stop that like at all. We forge ahead. But even before this, there was already a move towards renewable energies, greener technologies. There was a move to more embedded generation, looking at storage, even possibly looking at, well, how can I match gas and my renewables? So we were already on that path. And I think this basically just catapults us into where we should have been 5-6 years ago. One of the very first things that will come for your IPPs is that there will be a change in program. typically we have seen these large IPPs come on board, the renewable energy IPPs, coming in with 150 megawatts, and saying, I would like to do wind, I'd like to do solar, fully backed by government guarantee. You've got, ESCOM as the off-taker, and you're able to chart out your 20-year PPA and say that in year 1, this is how much I'll be making, and in year 19, month 6, this is how much I'll be making. And I think those are some of the things that we're going to have to let go of and understand that going forward, there are other opportunities that lie with municipalities, for instance. In South Africa, currently, we are looking at municipalities procuring their own electricity, and and not relying just on ESCOM. So there are those opportunities that will come for IPPs. There's also opportunities in embedded generation. You've got the likes of Sasol that recently announced a tender for 600 megawatts of gas. I think it's gas that they're looking for. You've got mining houses, Anglo, you've got Samanco, and they've come out and they've said, we are willing to come back into this space. However, we're going to have to relook how we do things. And the policy at the moment is shifting, albeit slowly, but it is shifting to say, can we give these IPPs opportunities in these spaces as well? So as a result of this, you will see some technology shifts, some things that we're not necessarily used to, or that we thought that we're not ready for. As Dion mentioned earlier on, we could be seeing a lot more battery coming, on board. You've got electric vehicles, you've got additional renewables, and you've also got gas. We've got a number of plants that we're considering currently where there's conversions from diesel to gas, combined cycle. You've got batteries for this load that has now changed. Our demand profile has changed, and in certain areas we actually do not need additional capacity. We need strengthening, we need looking at voltage issues, and those are some of the things that we'll be solving for in future. So in addition to that, the considerations for IPPs going forward should be looking at, am I flexible? And am I adaptable? And is my technology flexible as well? There's a cost element to it. Globally, there is a liquidity crunch at the moment. There's difficulty in borrowing in dollars. So, everybody is saying, I'm only going to look at the best projects and the projects that are ready. So, as an IPP, how ready is your project? How much does it cost? Does it compare to what the market actually offers? Also, what's your time to implementation? And as Dion mentioned, now more than ever, you don't want projects that will have time and cost overruns. You certainly are not looking for projects that are 5-6 years in the making. You're looking at projects that you can reach financial close within 6 to 8 months, and you can have your first unit online 6 or 8 months from there. So in 2 years' time, your projects should be up and running, feeding onto the grid. And technologies that will look at demand and will track, demand, will be flexible, and will look at, voltage. There's also a big thing around, if we're going to revive economies, especially using infrastructure, what does it mean? So going into these developing countries, being South African, for instance, are we going in as SA Inc., and are we saying that we're going to use South African contractors and South African lenders and South African consultants, and our own steel or whatever it is, and it's in packaging those deals as SA Inc. deals that also makes it palatable for other investors and for other countries, and it de-risks projects. So certainly there are opportunities for IPPs, but going forward, it's going to have to be strategic, it's going to have to be quick, and it's going to have multidisciplinary approaches. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all our speakers for their perspectives and their interesting points of view. I'm gonna hold on to something that the last speaker said, Ms. Michele, that in the developing countries, there is a need for energy. There was a need for energy, and there's a growing need for energy. And I'm going to link that with one of the questions that came from the audience quite in the beginning of the discussion on the potential or impact on electricity demand in South Africa, which links quite a lot with the discussion we have on the supply side. We are discussing on the transition and going towards the cleaner energy. But in the short term, the first immediate effect of COVID is on the demand side. So the question by the audience is, what is the potential impact on electricity demand in South Africa based on current mortality, the rate of infection, and where we are on the curve? So I would like the speakers to share with us their ideas. Maybe we shouldn't share too much on the current curve and everything, but maybe we can share our ideas on the short-term impact on electricity demand and long-term impact on electricity demand due to COVID. Anybody that would like to take on the question?
I can start.
Thank you.
Yes, Professor Rula, what was noticed is that the demand initially plummeted quite dramatically in the first couple of weeks after the state of lockdown. But even before the level of lockdown changed, it started emerging that gradually, week by week, and I'm talking now when one does a comparison to the same week of the previous year. So week by week, the demand was creeping back closer to the level that for that same week happened in the previous year. So whereas initially there was a dramatic drop, that started unwinding possibly as consumers and businesses started finding innovative ways to adapt, to continue with production and consumption and economic activity. And obviously now that we are one level lower in the lockdown levels and anticipating on the 1st of June to move another level lower, one will expect it to start moving back to normality. But I don't think it will be the same normal. It will be a new normal. Certain changes that we've been catapulted, a number of, I said that today, we've been catapulted into a new era, and certain changes might remain. Let me say, I think certain changes will remain. And nobody knows, but we need to understand that. We need to understand what the impact on the overall level of electricity consumption, as well as the shift in the demand patterns. And given, as Lungile also mentioned, the high risks with investments, this is not a time to commit to huge projects with long lead time, very inflexible once you've committed, without understanding all these things. So we must get a better understanding, and while we are developing our understanding, the proper response would probably be more flexibility in the approach, both on the network as well as the generating side, distributed generation, everything. More flexibility, greater ability to adapt as facts and evidence start emerging about how this, what will the long-term impact be. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mashele. You had something to say? Sorry, no. Okay, thank you. A follow-up on that was, we saw the demands, we hear that the demand is slowly picking up, and we see that the patterns might change. With which economic sectors do you think that they will be mostly affected by COVID? Because that will also affect the electricity demand and will also affect the changes in the electricity demand in the South African reality. Comments?
Professor Glazilot, currently in the city of Tshwane, our forecasts show that the construction industry The mining industry and manufacturing industry will be the hardest hit throughout this 2020 year. Now, obviously, the mining, manufacturing and construction industry are heavy energy users. So manufacturing includes all our automotive manufacturing cluster within a specific region within our city. I think for most of our forecasts, it's only agriculture, the agricultural sector that's up. All other sectors are down. So those are the biggest that are down. I think trade and finance and community services and transport are around 3-4%. That the projections are that it would be down. So obviously we'll see a concomitant depression in demand from that side, energy demand. But also you have to remember that a lot more people are at home currently. And a lot of those people actually now require energy in the home instead of at work or at school. So there is a bit of a trade-off in aggregate demand, where the picture is not that clear. Is demand really depressed to what type of percentage is it depressed?
Thank you. On another question from the audience, at what point will it be acceptable to start investing in long-term projects again? The friend from the audience is hearing a lot about the need for short-term projects at the moment, but we will need to start planning long-term again eventually. I know that in economics we say we don't have a magic ball where we can see and forecast, unfortunately for all of us, but when is the right time for investors to start looking long-term again? And if you foresee large-scale projects in the future, in what technologies are we going to start looking? Ms. Mashele.
Yes, so I actually wish that we had that crystal ball because I'd be a billionaire now. It looks to me like the billionaires already profited during this period. But at the moment, it would be very hard to say when things are going to look up again. I don't foresee that in the next 18 months, one would consider mega projects. Mega projects being projects that are in excess of $1 billion and projects that are large scale and that will take 5 to 6, if not 10 years to complete. I don't see any banks approving that. Perhaps looking at smaller projects and considering that with the liquidity crunch, there might be a need for lenders to syndicate and to perhaps club together in one deal. So that would mean that you would have multiple lenders coming in, which takes even longer to close deals. I don't think you would have deals where you just have one big lender who's got deep pockets, and who's willing to rescue. There's also a diversion of funds. So projects that would have been considered awesome and good to have might be diverted to, in the next 10 years, we'll look at it again, because now we've had to divert funds either to paying off our government debt or, or other more, emergency projects. So I would certainly take a bet on small renewable energy projects. I would definitely say energy efficiency will be a thing with more people, and perhaps this is smaller scale, but with more people at home, there will be an increased need for people to reduce electricity within their own homes. And they might be looking at, rooftop PV, they might be looking at a number of different technologies, because for the first time, they're actually seeing what consumption patterns look like. So there's definitely space, but definitely in the, I would say, residential spaces. Commercial, I'm not even seeing anything there. Office parks are vacant, they're empty. They had payback periods. If you look at malls, for instance, that had rooftop solar PV, and they had payback periods of 6 to 7 years. With what's currently happening, that payback period could actually double eventually. So there's definitely space, but not large, definitely small.
Thank you. Another question. Sorry, Mr. Huber.
Can I just add to that before you go to the next question, Prof? Yes, I would agree with Lungile, but there is another issue as well. There's a lot of the energy investment, especially in South Africa, that we're looking at over the next decade, will not be driven really by growth, but it will be more driven by a replacement of existing legacy systems that are reaching the ends of their lives. So even in the midst of uncertainty, there would still be a certain component of capacity investment on the generating side that would be pretty robust to any sort of a potential scenario that we can envisage sitting where we are now with all the uncertainty. And if you take the worst possible case going forward, there would still be some projects that would be required just because the existing legacy systems are reaching end of life, say in the next 10 years or so. And so that there would be some low risk grid scale type of investments, large, but the risk to those is that if distributed generation really become viable, there is a significant loss of economy of scale between a utility or a grid scale renewable plant and a small thing on a shopping mall parking lot or something. So there's a huge, currently a huge difference in economy of scale. But if that gap narrows sufficiently to offset the network cost, then distributed renewables will be the biggest threat to grid scale renewables. Well, in fact, to the entire network that will be impacted by that. So I'm not trying to say that even for replacement of existing legacy assets, there is no risk to the certain niche of capacity that will replace existing plant. It all depend on how the distributed side also develops. The gap is, according to calculations I've seen, large enough that I don't think that will happen very quickly, but it's a space to watch.
Thank you. Another question from the audience. How are labor-intensive industries and policies within the energy sector to adapt? How are they to adapt and the impact that they may have on the overall fuel cost? Could this then create stimulus for more automated industry and for more high-cost fuel sources to then enter the sector? So in essence, how do we deal with employment issues when it comes to automation of the industry? Especially under the circumstances where COVID and unemployment go hand in hand. Are we all trying to avoid the question?
Rula, let me Mashil, do you want to go?
Go ahead.
I think the drive towards automation is something we've seen in the South African economy for quite some time now. And I think there's a perception that our labor cost in South Africa is comparatively high vis-a-vis other countries. So this created an economic business case for a lot of large-scale manufacturing companies and industrial companies to automate. Obviously, with the indefinite need for social distancing that we're currently in, it would make sense for a company to automate. Obviously, this might come at a higher energy demand per unit produced. If our investment from an energy perspective is not implemented in the market quickly enough to actually address those increased energy demands, then obviously it will create the space for your typical higher cost sources of energy and your traditional fossil fuel sources of energy to still play a role. I think from a policy perspective, and it's something that I mentioned during the presentation on the decentralization, we have to be very clear what our policy should be and what our policies should aim to achieve. And one of those is we need to make sure that our investment space is conducive for a future that we want. But in order for us to achieve that, we need to understand now what does the future that we want look like. And I think we do have a bit of time, not a lot, but we do have a bit of time to actually think through those questions and work through them thoroughly, so that we can create the policy space and the policy instruments that will enable, if we face an automated world, but an automated world where people's incomes are still protected in some way. If we face an automated world and an increase for energy demand, that increase is then channeled to some sort of supply mix base where there's a larger component of renewable energies involved.
Thank you very much. Ms. Maseli, you had a comment?
No, I've got nothing further to add to what Nadu said. Thank you.
Then we can ask a last comment maybe from Mr. Katabua, that has been very quiet throughout the presentation, and that will be our last comment for today's webinar. A general comment from your side for our discussion, Mr. Katabua.
Yes, thank you very much for that. I think when you're talking about energy transition, we typically focus on the resource, but we also have to acknowledge that within the value chain, the transition can happen anywhere along the value chain, being from the resource to the power plant itself, to the carrier, to the converter. For example, innovation in light bulbs, moving from incandescents to CFLs to LEDs, all of that is also part of the energy transition, as well as the service that is required. There's also innovation within the service, we're typically within energy efficiency. So when we're talking about emerging countries or developing countries, energy transition, the focus has been on decarbonization because yes, that's the immediate threat with respect to global warming. But if we focus just on that and neglecting the other elements along the value chain of the whole energy supply, I think we could be losing a bit of opportunity. We also have to acknowledge then that as developing countries, we are net importers of technology. And being net importers of technology, we don't have a lot of leeway to innovate within, say, the converter or the turbine or whatever it may be. So, but one thing where we can have a handle on is investing in our human capital. Human capital being our people. So we should look to develop our skills, develop skills for PV and wind, for example, given the fact that we know that we're going to be deploying a lot of renewables, I don't know, 10 gigawatts plus in the next 10 years in the region. All of that will need to be serviced, will need to be installed, in as much as it may be a specialized domain, but it only takes about 6 months of training or so to get qualified. Our policy should be that as we import the technology, part of that importation of technology is also knowledge transfer in order for to allow the region to be self-sufficient in terms of skills. That's my contribution.
Thank you.
Rula, is that the last question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. IAEE wishes to thank Rula and our distinguished panelists for an outstanding webinar today. I know I personally learned quite a bit, and I'm very grateful for all of your time. For those listening, this webinar will be available on IAEE's website for future download. If you're not a member of IAEE, we encourage you to join by visiting us at www.iaee.org. Thank you for attending, and now I officially close this webinar. Good day.